and that's the only portion of the building that would encroach into that required setback. And it does provide 161 parking stalls on site where none would otherwise be required. There's also above the parking garage, the applicant's providing an amenity deck that you see here in the bottom left with pool, landscaping, and other outdoor space that helps meet the intent of the open space requirement. It is in a very potentially dense area with D1 right close by. We see that this area could potentially develop with no setbacks and very dense development in the future. With that, staff's recommending approval for both the design review and the plan development requests, just with the condition that signage, lighting, and remaining landscape details be delegated to staff for final review. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and have the applicant come forward.
So our live stream just went out. We could maybe blame the weather, I'm not sure. So we might want to pause while we wait for that to come back up.
Okay. Well, we'll pause for just a moment and see if we can get the streaming resolved.
Okay, the stream is back, so we should be good to continue.
Okay. Remember to state your names for the record, and you'll have 10 minutes or so.
We're okay to start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Good evening. My name's Jake Finlinson with Overland Group. Overland Group is a vertically integrated real estate company that specializes primarily in apartments, hotels, and retail. We've been around for over 40 years and have been the recipient of various design and redevelopment awards during that time. Working with us on the project are FFKR Architects and Talisman Civil Consultants, both who have impressive resumes. We're excited to be able to share the project with you today. I'll go fast over these slides as I know Eric already went over some of these, but just some context to the site between 300 and 400 South along 300 East. It's within the high mixed use designation of the central community and in the RMU zone. The site currently consists of 2 abandoned office buildings that were built in the 60s, and it's nestled between an abandoned apartment complex to the south and residential condos to the north, and to the west and northwest are parking lots. These are the view of the buildings as well as looking onto 300 East from the buildings. And then across the street is the Wasatch Computer office building and the YWCA building. All right, getting into specifics. So Overland on 3rd is a 12-story mixed-use building that has a facade primarily of glass, brick, and ephes. This is the view from the northeast, a view from the southwest, and from the southeast. Now, Overland on 3rd was designed with careful consideration of the specific needs and character of the area. We aim to create a development that integrates with the existing urban fabric, as well as enhances the neighborhood's overall quality of life. To achieve this, we focused on 3 of the city's goals and objectives for the area: sustainability, transit-oriented development, and a variety of housing types. To support a variety of housing types, we provided a range of units. So we have studios that offer a more affordable option, as well as rental opportunities for roommates or families with our 2 and 3 bed units. Salt Lake City's TOD goals are central to the project's design. The track station at 400 South, because of that proximity, it will already promote public, pedestrian, and bicycle transportation. To further encourage that bicycle use, we're providing secure bike storage, as well as a wash and repair room. The parking's been oriented to the rear of the site, and that's in order to preserve the human connection to 300 East, as well as to mitigate disruption to the neighbors. Openings into the garage, which will allow for ventilation and daylight, are offset from the neighbors to the north and only abut the parking lots to the west and northwest. The arrows in red that you see are the entrances to the building. So the one on top is the pedestrian, and the one to the south is the vehicle. Here's the view of the rear of the building, as well as the parking garage. All right, moving on to the facade. So the facade's been designed to reduce the perceived width and height of the building. And we do that with the use of bookends that you can see in pink. The exclamation point, as we call it, in blue is a feature wall that punctuates the street front. The area in red caters to the pedestrian experience with pedestrian scaled approach, as well as clear entrance areas into the building. Using a variation of colors and materials, we've designed the building with a distinct base, middle, and top to help further break up that perceived height of the building. Further, the frame of the bookend helps provide a more proportional transition to the buildings to the north and the south. To enhance the sustainability objectives, Overland on 3rd is planned to be built with a concrete and cross-laminated timber structure. CLT, or cross-laminated timber, is a solid engineered wood panel system that provides superior fire, thermal, and seismic performance. It's made by layering in alternating directions layers of lumber, and it's bound together with a structural adhesive. CLT offers less than half the embodied CLT buildings, offer less than half the embodied CO2 than concrete buildings, and offer reduced emissions during construction. Another big benefit of CLT construction is a reduced construction time frame, and that will help mitigate the disruption to the community. In the design of the building, we really focused on the tenant experience, focusing on amenities that contribute to the themes of sustainability, transit-oriented development, and community. So in addition to the unit amenities, as well as some of the community amenities that have already been shared by Eric or I, we're planning on providing a swimming pool, a sauna, fitness room, as well as a Zen garden. Overall, we are excited at the prospect of contributing to the built environment of Salt Lake City. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the commissioner?
I guess it's a question for staff. If we don't want to reduce the rear yard setback, they could still go for a 125-foot height. Is that correct?
That's correct, because the reduced rear yard setback is part of the plan development, so you could disapprove that portion.
Okay.
Still have the additional height in the design
And
review.
still have additional height with the conditional use.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for the applicant. So I'm kind of getting mixed signals from what I read and what I've heard in terms of your ground floor space. I don't know that any of it is actually retail for the public. It seems that it's all amenities for your tenants, correct?
Sorry, excuse me for not noting on that. So we are offering a ground floor retail area, about 1,500 square feet, that is adjacent to some of those amenities, but is separate in nature. So that will actually be, I don't know if I can draw, but it's closer to that Overland on 3rd signage that you see.
Okay, so there's 1,500 square feet that will be actual retail.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Jackson Ferguson with FFKR Architects. It will have its own entrance. It will have its own entrance.
And how high is the ceiling? How high is that floor?
The first floor, I believe, is 13 feet from floor to ceiling, and then the remaining floors are 10 foot on each floor.
Maybe you want to comment on setback in the rear. The existing buildings have a parking garage in the back, and it is built to the property line. So us creating a 10-foot setback will actually be new to the area. There is no setback currently.
Or you have to speak louder, right into the microphone.
Okay. The existing parking garage on the site has no setback. So when we add a 10-foot setback, that will be new. The current space has no setback.
How tall is the existing parking terrace?
The existing parking garage is 2-story, so it's about 1.5 with the parapet wall.
And you will have 3 stories?
Correct.
Be taller by half a floor. Okay.
So I noticed that you have a lot of tandem parking. How many spaces are tandem versus how many are single?
I would have to count that to know the exact number, but it's less than half.
So half of what? Half the spaces?
Correct. Half the parking spaces.
Half the parking spaces are tandem. When you
Less than half.
Okay. When you lease the tandem spaces, are you going to lease them to the same unit owner?
Yeah, to the same unit owner. We do have a fairly large percentage of 2 and 3 bed units on the building. We really want to cater to those the variety of housing types that we kind of talked about.
So many of the units will have no parking available.
Potentially.
It's just a question.
Potentially.
It's not.
I'm not
It's
sure.
not a judgment call.
Yeah,
It's just,
potentially.
it's actual, because with so many tandem parking spaces that have to be given to one unit, you've got about a 1-to-1 ratio right now of units to parking spaces. So, but if a lot of them are essentially 2-bedroom parking spaces,
Yes.
you can't. There's going to be quite a few that will not be. How will you sort that out among your tenants?
Yeah, so really the goal in this for the project and the thing that we were trying to balance was the objectives of the city code, the parking requirements the city has, as well as the requirements that the neighbors would like, as it relates to the needs of our tenants. And so it was really trying to find the balance of the most parking that we could provide, with the understanding of the fairly low requirement that the city has for parking for this area.
I don't think there's any. Is there? There's no parking required in
think
this
there
area.
is any.
Is that correct?
It was
Yeah, that's correct. It's in the transit context, which has no minimum parking requirement.
Right. So it's only a block from the tracks line.
Yes.
Right. So essentially, we're providing a lot of parking in an area that doesn't theoretically need it.
Yes.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and open up the public hearing. Do we have anyone from the community council that represents this location who would like to speak? Okay. We have one card from Cindy Cromer. Go ahead and state your name for the record, and you'll have 2 minutes.
So recently I was looking for a particular quote by Jane Jacobs, the one about the broken windows. And instead I found a different one, which I think addresses our current situation in Salt Lake. Jane wrote, "The primary conflict is between people whose interests are with already well-established economic activities and those whose interests are with the emergence of new economic activities. This proposal represents the new economic activity. It will, without question, diminish the enjoyment of the established investors at the Sampson Altadena condominiums, and as proposed, the Overland project is likely to constrain the redevelopment of the site of the former historic apartment building to the northwest. Years ago, a developer proposed moving the required landscaping from the front yard to an unusable corner in the rear of the property. I argued that the substitution of unusable space for highly prominent space could not be justified. The substitution of private amenity open space for residents cannot reasonably be substituted for open space at ground level. This wall rising straight up from 300 East is not at all pedestrian friendly. There is no opportunity for outdoor dining. I don't know why the city keeps wishing for more inviting sidewalks and permitting the opposite. You have to require a pedestrian amenity, not wish for it. And finally, there's much being made of the 3-bedroom units. I don't know what percentage of the overall mix they are because the number of units has now changed pretty significantly by 30 units or so. But they were 5% of the units going, and if you think that 5% of the units at 3 bedrooms are going to parents with children, you are wrong. They're not. 9 units and the original numbers were not going to get us anywhere with respect to families with children.
Thank you. If anyone would like to give comment, go ahead and step up to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Ann Ruth Isaacson. I'm the HOA president of the Sampson Altadena. It is not apartments, it's condominiums. There are 17 owners borrowing a lot of money to historically restore this building. So we really value maintaining that. I brought a picture, and I could leave it here and get back another time, of the building. It was built about a decade after this building, and we really value our space. I have another owner here who's going to talk about the grounds. I want to talk quickly. Okay.
Oh, you've got to keep the microphone with you so everyone can
Okay.
hear you.
I know planning has verbally discussed that only the farthest parallel is the rear yard. However, over time, people sell land and the lots change. The existing building has a 30-foot setback, as our building does, from what is a rear yard line. Okay, so anywhere else in the country, planning or architects would consider this a rear yard line. And we right now share that with this building, and this is the source of our southern light. Ricky's going to talk about the planting. We really do not want to lose this 30-foot setback that goes back 37 and a half feet. If you look at our buildings, they're a little bit taken out of proportion in the design. We made this mock-up to show, this dark green line would be the buildable lot if they respected the 30-foot setbacks in the code. Okay, they want the 10-foot, and they don't want to have the 30-foot setback there. So they end up with a really large building that looks like a warehouse mass to me. And I question why the city would allow them to build up to 125 feet when they haven't even utilized so much of the portion of their site for 75 feet. They could get their programmatic needs met in the 75-foot building, okay? So I really question what we're getting back as a community and in terms of what we're losing.
That's 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Do we need to document those items for the record?
Yes, somehow. We'll take some
Okay.
pictures of them.
Yes, if you'd like to speak, go ahead and approach the microphone, state your name for the record, and you'll have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Frederick Hansing, an owner and resident also at Sampson Altadena. And just reinforcing to a degree what Ann Ruth was mentioning about the side yard step back not being a rear yard step back. Right now, she's absolutely correct in that it runs parallel to our existing building. That's where most of our light to our historic garden's been there for, our building's 120 years old. It's been there probably 120 years. So definitely that's the main concern here about the jog that was described. Just that being the main source of light for our entire community, for the back gardens where, we're 6 years into a renovation project of our building just to keep it historic and relevant, and part of that is the gardens, so just a concern. But yeah, I love some of the design elements that were provided to bring the scale down, so looking forward to hopefully being a good neighbor.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Have we received any emails in the meantime? Okay. We'll go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for discussion and a motion.
So am not in favor of privatizing 100% of the landscaping on this project. The commission has in the past supported privatizing portions of landscaping that become amenities for the tenants, but this is 100%. The grass area in the back that's 10 feet of that setback is definitely not a public amenity, and then putting the rest of that on top is of the garage is not accessible or beneficial to the community. So if we look at the plan development standards of open space and natural lands, all 6 items of those are not being met at all. And I'm definitely in favor of the height. I think this downtown area is, for the design review, I think the additional height can be appropriate. But if we're talking about the plan development, and then we have a 3-foot setback on the east side, that is all concrete and no landscaping. And the presumption for a plan development is that, an applicant is saying, if I can get relief from these particular parts of the code, I think I can do a better project. But if we look at, by right, the RMU zone, they are required to do that 20% landscaping for under the plan development. And so I'm not necessarily sure on that particular front if we are getting a better project under the plan development.
I tend to agree. I think we get the same number of units and have an open space and even maintain the open space that's next to the existing historic building and even maintain the what I consider to be really too much parking. But I know that's always an issue with these units that are going to be more expensive. Ideally, I would like to see I would like to see open space that's accessible on the street, maybe even some kind of garden that's between the tall building and a historic building. But I know that requires a redesign. I'm very confident that FFKR, which is an excellent architecture firm, can redesign this building so that it still accommodates the same number of units, same amount of parking space, and still has an open space component, because I also don't understand why the entire building is on the very frontage instead of using the entire site, just as the folks from next door were saying.
Mr. Chair, if there's no more discussion, I'll proceed with motions. We'll start with the motion for the design review, which is PLN PCM 2023-0113. Based on the information presented in discussion, I move that the Commission approve this design review application as recommended by staff.
Mr. Chair, I'll second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Berry and a second from Commissioner Bitton. Any discussion to the motion? We'll go ahead and vote then. Commissioner Santos Rivera.
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer.
Yes.
Commissioner Berry.
Yes.
Commissioner Gale.
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
Commissioner Bitton.
Yes.
And the chair will also vote yes. That passes unanimously.
I'm willing to make an attempt at the next one. This would be a motion for the plan development portion, PLN PCM 2023-00114. I move that the Commission deny this plan development application because evidence has not been presented that demonstrates the proposal complies with the following standard. In the plan development standards, that would be A, which is the open space and landscaping section, parts 1 through 6. B, the historic section. C, housing affordability. D, mobility. That is my motion.
I'll second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Berry and a second from Commissioner Scheer. Any discussion to the motion? We'll go ahead and vote.
Just a point of clarification. No, never mind.
I wonder if I can also say that I don't think it meets standard E for sustainability, because that without the landscaping on the second above the garage with no water, dry landscaping, then it doesn't necessarily meet the
Are you making a friendly amendment?
yeah,
All right, I'll accept that.
thanks. It doesn't necessarily meet the recognizing water as a limited resource.
The friendly amendment has been accepted. We'll go ahead and take a vote. Commissioner Gale.
I mean, it's a complicated motion. I don't know that I agree with all of the rationale behind it, but I'm going to vote no. Yes, I'm going to vote yes.
Yes, okay. Commissioner Berry.
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer.
Yes.
Commissioner Santos Rivera.
No.
Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
Commissioner Bitton.
No.
And the chair will also vote no. That motion to deny passes 5-3. And we will go ahead and move on to the next item. The next item is text amendments to daycare uses. Case number PLN PCM 2019-00225. And our planners are Cassie Younger and Aaron Barlow.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Erin and I are here to present our text amendments on daycare facilities. We discussed this item a few weeks with you all at the August 9th work session. Since then, even more bad news has come out about the state of childcare in Utah. As you can see from these headlines that are all from the past month, pandemic-era funding given to daycares to keep them afloat during COVID has expired as of September this year. And without this federal aid, many daycares will be forced to either close or raise their rates. A study from 2020 showed that the Salt Lake County has a capacity shortage of over 20,000 children that are in need of childcare and don't have it. With the pandemic funding running out, it is forecast that as many as 663 programs throughout Utah may have to close, which would increase this shortage dramatically. As you can see from our map, we have shown all of our existing facilities here. We currently have just 35 licensed home daycares and 49 daycare centers. In order to fill the capacity shortage that we already have, Salt Lake County would need an additional 454 home daycares and 99 centers to fulfill this shortage, which does not include any future shortage that may come from the ending of this federal funding. So this problem is only getting worse. Reducing zoning barriers is essential and should only be the first step in what the city does to ensure childcare in the city.
So on August 9th, we came to you with a few questions and a few proposals. We discussed, we summarized the proposal as it was presented then. We had answered some questions about state regulations, and answers to those questions are in the staff report. If you have follow-up questions, we can save that till the end. We also discussed the second home daycare issue and how to address that, as well as guidance on how we should be permitting these home daycares, whether as permitted uses or as a home occupation. So at that meeting, the commission recommended that planning staff move forward for daycares as a permitted use. However, after some further review and discussions with the business licensing division and building services, a few issues came up. First, there would be higher fees if we reviewed these things as permitted uses as opposed to home occupations. Currently, home daycares aren't required to pay a fee for a business license. If we move to permitted use, that may increase to around $180 per license. And then there's also commercial occupancy requirements for those types of requests, which would increase the overhead for starting a new business. It's sprinklers, a hood for stoves, grease capture, the kind of things bathrooms, those things that you see in commercial establishments. So because of that, staff opted to keep this in a home occupation and did some finagling so that it would meet and not mess things up too much in the home occupation section. So as a summary, the changes that are proposed for home daycares are first to eliminate non-registered home daycares. Those aren't regulated by the city, and they make things confusing for building services and business licenses. The other was to increase the max number of children from 8 to 16 to align with state code. And of course, the proportion requirements for different age groups does not always lead to 16 children, especially if those children are toddlers or infants. And then we moved home daycares to the home occupation section of zoning regulations, and then provided that provision to allow for a second licensed home daycare for a provider without a primary residential use.
So this zoning map shows the existing zoning conditions for daycare centers as they are allowed in the city. As you can see, the green shows the permitted areas of the city. The yellow shows where daycare centers are listed as a conditional use. But we have development standards in our conditional use section for daycare centers that requires daycare centers to have a 20,000 minimum lot size requirement and to be located on an arterial street. So as you can see, even though it shows a large area for conditional use in our zoning, only the properties in orange are actually eligible to build a daycare currently. So our proposed changes just show switching all zones to have daycare centers be a permitted use in all areas of the city. This means changing it from a conditional to a permitted use in some residential zones and adding it as a permitted use in the foothill residential zones, neighborhood business, foothill protections, and the forum-based urban neighborhood zones. And then we're also proposing to eliminate all those existing conditional use standards in our code.
So in reviewing this, we aligned it to see how it lined up with Plan Salt Lake and those the guiding principles in that plan. So first, this proposal provides opportunities in neighborhoods for social interaction and services needed to maintain the well-being of the community at a neighborhood level. Ensures equity by increasing the opportunities for daycare, not only as a business provider, but as someone who needs that daycare to be able to work. And then providing opportunities for those entrepreneurs to start their businesses and reducing the barriers that may exist within our zoning regulations. So that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you. Any questions?
Hi, Cassie. Hi, Aaron. I do have a question. I was not present for that first meeting that you guys had, but I was certainly watching that night. It was an interesting discussion among this body, but I want to just ask the same question that some of the folks had that day, and one was about because we know there's a specific quota that they can have, and I think that your proposed plan is looking at 16 instead of 8. And just if you can please clarify, what does that quota look like per age? And because I remember you kind of mentioned that, but if you can reiterate that, that would be great.
Yeah, so that quota is just for the home daycare use, and because home daycares are more mixed ages, whereas opposed to in a center you have like a room for each age, so it's a little different for the home daycares because it assumes you have 8 of different ages. So the ratio basically is 4-to-1 for any child under 2, and then it increases to about 1-to-6 once they're, I think, 3, and then when it goes up to 7 for older than 4. But how they calculate that for a mixed group is kind of confusing. So we did try to show in the staff report the different ages. So you can have like 1 infant, 2 toddlers, and then the rest have to be over 3. And then I did link the ratio requirements for home daycares in the staff report as well. So it gives you lots of calculations and possibilities.
Thank you, Cassie. Yeah, that does answer my question. I am in full support of this, item. I just want to say, like, it's needed, and it has a huge, implications in our community, especially young professionals, women, young families in a state like Utah and Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City. This is just the way to go about it. I think everyone can enjoy, the vision of biking with your kid from your home to a day center, nearby. I think that's just like adds so much safety and peace of mind. So I'm in full support.
I was impressed with how much the need was last time when you spoke to us in August, and now it sounds like it is worse. I don't remember the numbers or the map from the last time, but where you say we have 84 of these of both types in our city and we need 553, that's so significant that I was glad not to see like 1 per block, like a limit like that, like a geographical limit, because we do need so many, and because I just think that if it, I guess if it happens that a couple of blocks somewhere turn into an entire daycare, hub, then maybe we can think about that at that time. But the need is really great right now, and we talked about moving it out of the home occupation last time, but if it makes better sense to stay in and is more clear and costs less and it kind of decreases the barriers to starting one of these daycares, then I'm moved by your advice in that way, like to leave it that way if that's the way that it works better. So I'm glad to see this.
So my understanding from the last time, and maybe I'm just remembering this wrong, is that I thought that the licensed daycare provider could do this in their home, or in a home, but they could also have a second business in another home. Now it seems like there's no homes and there's no residence required at all for any of these, and you can have as many as you want.
It's still limited to 2
It is.
per provider, and that's according to state laws as well.
Oh, that's a state law.
Yeah.
Okay, so the provider can only have 2, but neither one of them have to be residential use and the daycare.
We worded it in the code as the second location for your home daycare would not have to be a residential use.
Well, but this code, I can't find where that says in there. It says basically that they're exempt from that requirement of having a residential use.
Yes, for the second location, the first is still a home occupation.
Okay.
So we did have to change the wording in a few other areas so it didn't cancel out that rule. But when you look under the standards for the home daycare centers under home occupations, it specifies that only the second location is exempt from that residential primary use.
Licensed home daycares are exempt from having the business be accessory to the residential use. That's what it says under home occupation. And it says it's educational daycare opportunities for children that is located in a building intended for residential use, but not that it is used for residential, but intended, which for me means that it's a building type that is generally residential type, which is different from a use type. So where does it say? I don't see anywhere where it says first one and second one. Maybe I'm just missing it, but I would like to see that, because if I don't find it, somebody else might find it.
Would you be more or less comfortable with just the second daycare being exempt from that, or?
Yeah, I mean,
Are you
I think
comfortable with
I
all
think
of
that
them?
what one of the things that we discussed was actually a little bit of trouble with the second daycare not having a residence there because of security and blah 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 and the neighborhood and so forth. So
what was the specific section you were referencing just now?
just now I was looking at two things. One was,
The H?
yeah, let's see. Okay,
In HC,
the definition of home occupation. Okay. It's on page 16 of your daycare amendments.
yes, so. Home occupation, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. The definition of home occupation, and in page 15, a home daycare definition, daycare comma home, which is also in page 15, which says it's in a building intended for residential use. It doesn't say it's in a building used for residential use. That's a very different thing.
That's correct, but if for a home occupation, as it is enforced and by state law, there has to be a residence for that first location.
That is not what it says. It says, at least in your thing, if I'm just reading your thing, it basically says that you're exempt from that particular thing.
So I think under home occupation, it says a trade conducted for gain or support and located and conducted within a dwelling unit, which use is accessory, incidental, and secondary to the use of the building for dwelling purposes and does not change the essential residential character. So it's saying that that business can be conducted, but that use of that building for that purpose is secondary to the primary use, which is residential dwelling.
Except that under G, whichever that was, we were just reading, that actually, that says that this particular thing is not, are exempt from those standards. General standards, licensed home daycares are exempt from these standards, the one you were just reading.
What page you're looking at G on?
Okay, sorry, it's 21.
That's correct. They're exempt from the general standards and shall be reviewed as home daycares.
And
in
all of
Section
the
H.
other, so the dwelling unit thing, they're exempt from that. They're exempt from incidental and secondary to the primary use. They're exempt from the number of employees, blah, blah, blah.
I wonder if we're just conflating two different definitions of the two different daycares. It sounds like maybe we are. Am I not getting that? Like the use that's under the home occupation, that is not required to be in a building where the primary use is still residential?
So we did leave the definition more broad, but under the home occupations for the home daycare. But when you read the standards for the home daycares in that home occupation section, it does specify that only the second location is exempt from that use.
Where is that, please?
It's in Section H1C
And that is on what page?
on page 22. And there are limitations on how much that home can be modified.
So they're exempt from certain things, home occupations. And what's the difference between a home occupation, a daycare is a home occupation, and a home daycare?
That's the same thing.
Same thing.
Okay. Then why is it not defined as home daycare in the definitions?
Because home daycares are sort of a complex
Specific home.
animal compared to other home occupations. Like we discussed before, you may have an attorney's office inside of your house. as opposed to wrangling children inside of your home. And it's not exempt from other sections, you know, the home occupation sections A, B, C, and D.
I just think this is, I'm not an attorney, so I will leave it to the attorneys to determine whether this is confusing or not, but it's certain. As someone who might actually, you know, qualify to own home daycare, this is, I understand what you're trying to do, but it's even unclear in page 22, because basically it says that you have a second licensed home daycare location under the same license, but it doesn't say anything about the first one being required to be to be in a house that there's a resident in.
Mr. Chair, can I make a comment?
Yes.
In the introductory language in paragraph H, it does say that a home daycare may be allowed as a permitted use and within legal conforming single-family, duplex, and multifamily dwellings. Then the multifamily dwellings have a qualifier when they're in commercial and non-residential zoning districts. So it does say that it has to be in a dwelling.
It has to be in a single-family dwelling, but a single-family dwelling does not have to have a residential use.
But for a home occupation, it does. So we have the home occupation
So, yeah,
as the
I
main
know,
heading.
but you would say that
and a
a
list of-
vacant single-family dwelling is not a family dwelling?
No, it's, so the home occupation, the resident who operates the business has to live in that home for all home occupations. A home daycare
Except that you've exempted this particular
No,
use for that.
No, we haven't. That's in the,
Okay.
that is a
All right,
requirement for
that-
all home occupations.
Okay. I withdraw all my objections. I love it. It's great.
So I do have a interesting question. So let's say that the structure that the building that they're looking into make a daycare, they have an ADU. Then the person who operates that child care center can live in that ADU, or
Those are separate dwellings, an
Yeah.
ADU versus a principal dwelling. I don't know that a small ADU would meet all of the state code requirements, and with a shared yard, there may be may be required to negotiate the use of that yard for a daycare, but that is allowed under this code. If someone is in an accessory dwelling, they could operate a daycare according to the state regulations.
sounds good. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and open up the public hearing on this. Do we have anyone from a community council who would like to speak on this? We do have one card. Denise Montgomery, would you like to go ahead and step up to the microphone and state your name, and you'll have 2 minutes.
My name is Denise Montgomery, and I'm with the Utah Private Child Care Association. And part of why I'm here is to explain that this stuff is not true, what you're seeing. This is licensing standards right here for a licensed center. What they are asking for is something like this. How do we compete? I've been in business since 1988. I have a licensed center. I checked with all the centers in Salt Lake County. They're all at 50% capacity. There is plenty of room for these kids at licensed centers with big rules, 296 pages. Okay, so them saying there's all these empty spots, there are not that many kids in need. I am partnered with DDI Vantage, Early Head Start, and Indian Nation. Let me tell you, before COVID, we were 100% full. Every center was. After COVID, we are at 50%. the majority, I would say 85% of us. Okay? This is just the paperwork you have to have for license on your employees. Okay? They have to have background checks. What they're asking for is what happened years ago, and everybody, I have here from the state, and I can give this to you. This is deaths last year, and the only deaths happened in licensed home cares. Not even the ones like they're wanting that are not licensed. I called licensing. The reason they are not here is because they don't want any rules. And licensing said until there's rules, they're not going to get involved. And home care's rules, they're about half of what a license center is. And I'm on 4 South and Redwood Road. Okay, there's United Way has a daycare there. I know all the daycare owners in Salt Lake County. They all are telling me their enrollment is down to nothing. So what you're going to have is unregulated, because in home cares, they only go into a home care maybe every 2 years if it's licensed. And their book is a third of this licensing book. Okay, so I know my center, which is in Salt Lake City, is half full. I know everyone I know who has one here is half full. So where they got the numbers, I have no clue. Even going out to West Valley, everywhere, we're all hurting. But we have to do these rules, and I pay $20,000 in property tax. What are these houses going to pay?
Yeah.
And I have 20 employees, which means they may lose jobs. But having a home care next to you, because I have one next to me, it's the worst nightmare in the world. Because it's next to my house, it's annoying, and I figured out, even if they have the lowest rates, and they're saying 8 kids, right? That's $11,000 a month. That's with low rates, okay? So if you allow them 2 daycares, that's $20,000. They don't have the employees. My liability is $30,000 a month. We drive to schools. The vans are $10,000 each. And if we have to compete with this or nothing, and there's room in these, and the state pays these rates. So I don't know what this is. It makes no sense to me. I don't see why I'm here representing all the licensed centers, except for I only got this notice a week ago, and I've been able to get what I could together in that week.
Yeah, that's 2 minutes.
I thought you said if you're a part of association.
It has to be officially registered with the city.
Utah Private Child Care Association? They're the Utah Private Child Care. They're not with the city.
No, it'd only be for recognized community organizations, councils, or Downtown Alliance, or those sorts of organizations.
Okay. But is there any way I could just have a few seconds more to tell you what licensing?
We'll go ahead and give you a few more seconds.
Okay, in a licensed center, supervision means having awareness and response. This is a licensing rule. Awareness and responsibility for each child and being near enough to intervene as needed. They cannot be out of your sight in a licensed center or a licensed home center. So how the heck, in most of these little Salt Lake houses, are you going to put 16 kids in an area that's big enough that you can see every single child? In a center or a licensed home care, you have to be able to see them. They cannot be downstairs watching TV. We're not even allowed to watch TV. So where's the supervision going to come? Because so they won't even go into these places. They don't even go into home cares. So you've got a whole situation that's supposed to be regulated, but nobody wants to do it. And I'll go back to, this happened to me personally. I've been in business since 1988. In 1998, I don't know if you remember in West Valley, but there was an unlicensed child care center, and she was cooking lunch for the children. And the 5 little girls got in the trunk, and they all died. 3 of these girls ended up being one of my parents. They were her 3 girls. They all died. She ended up adopting 2 kids, and she put them in my center and says she wished she had never done that. Because in a center, you have a cook. You have a bus driver. You are not doing this stuff while you're watching kids. It is not possible. I can promise you, It is not possible to cook for 16 kids and watch them and them all be in your reach if something happens that you have to grab them. And the 2 deaths last year were in licensed home cares. So you're talking, these guys want less in licensing because licensing isn't here. I talked to Simone today, and he's like, unless you make it that they have to be licensed, licensing isn't involved. So you could have all these centers running like this, and this is what came about. This was half this size. These kids dying in the trunk, they went overboard and started licensing everything, which was great. But the point is, they've slacked again, and you guys are going to be part of the slacking if you allow this. I'm telling you. Because you will have kids dying, because they're dying now in licensed home cares, not in child care centers. And you're basically giving them 16 kids to watch. Try that. My teachers watch 4. It's 1-to-4 ratio with babies. 1-to-7. That's it. And she's in a room. She doesn't cook. Her food is brought to her. Breakfast, lunch, snack, and dinner. There is not a shortage on childcare. I don't know where they got it from. I could find you hundreds, 500 spots in Salt Lake City right now. So whatever you're hearing, and I would say if you're going to do this, you be licensed so this does not come back on you when you start having deaths, and that's what happens. It comes back at you.
Yeah. Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Go ahead and approach the microphone, and you'll have 2 minutes.
I think you already appreciate how complicated this issue is. I just want to link the nexus of the connection between affordable housing, childcare shortage, and school closure with a few remarks. I have not read the staff report, and I look forward to doing that when I get past a few more deadlines. First of all, the economic reality, this is from one of my family members with 3 children. Working full-time, he was earning $200 more than the cost of childcare for 3 young children. He quit working. He's now a full-time super dad, organizing activities, and I think he has a future in childcare. He's really good at it. I want to tell you a story that happened last month about a local landlord who signed a lease with some tenants and found that they intended to operate a childcare facility in his building, in the apartment he just rented to them. He voided the lease. He was within the probationary period, and they lost their housing. So clarity about what's allowed and what's not allowed is really important. I don't have much turnover, so I don't negotiate new leases, but the next time I have a turnover, I'll pay attention to that issue. And I think with the number of schools the city is considering, the city school district is considering closing, and the fabulous daycare I see operating out of churches, it would really be great if we made better use of our closed school buildings and our churches that are vacant most of the week. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to give comment? Seeing no one else, have we received any emails? We'll go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for discussion and eventually a motion.
Well, I think the economics of this is very simple. There was a study done by ACOs and also the Utah Chamber of Commerce that identified that childcare issues resulting in 1.3 billion in losses in revenue each year, and this is all from the Utah Chamber of Commerce. But only that, we already heard that we need around 400 childcare centers. That we are 23,259 childcare shortage. As for 2020, I don't even know what is it as for today. And and about it, again, just circling back to one of the Salt Lake City Tribune articles that they published recently, and this is also done by the Center for American in Progress. About 77% of Utahns live in a childcare desert. Again, it is an equity issue, and this is the way that we can do it in a local, municipal level, that we can stimulate the economy, that we can get our kids, the essential services that parents need and kids needs. And what a best way to do it than your community members. I think this is great. This is just part of my discussion.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a clarifying question of staff prior to making a motion? So just to clarify, we're not relaxing any business licensing standards. This is just zoning regulation.
This is just zoning. They still have to follow all of the state licensing requirements for either the daycare center or the home licensed daycare center. We're not reducing any of those standards or rules or regulations.
Okay. And then we're aligning closely with state, bringing it in alignment with state law.
Exactly.
Okay. Mr. Chair, based on the information presented in discussion, I move that the commission forward a positive recommendation to adopt this text amendment to the City Council.
I second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Bitton and a second from Commissioner Santos Rivera. Any discussion to the motion?
I don't want to discuss the motion necessarily, but I am kind of interested in whether or not there are any studies or information that relate to how this approach to daycare centers and home daycare might affect affordability.
In terms of using a residence as a home
Is it
daycare?
cheaper to do it in a house than it is in a daycare center? Is that the motivation for this?
To open up a home daycare, there's a much lower overhead. A commercial establishment, like any business, requires a lot of rent, making sure the building meets specific commercial building codes. License fees are higher. You have to hire employees, and not only
And the complications, how does this affect affordability?
for housing or for
For
daycare.
daycare.
Daycare affordability. A business with lower overhead.
Care, does it affect the affordability, or is it just a wash? It costs the same no matter what.
We put a graph in the staff report that showed that as a percentage of income, those surveyed in the Salt Lake Tribune showed that those in home daycares gave a smaller percentage of their income. So that will show you, that kind of tells you that it is more affordable for families.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take a vote on the motion. Commissioner Bitton,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle,
Yes.
Commissioner Santos Rivera,
Yes.
Commissioner Shear,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
No.
Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
and the chair will also vote yes. That passes with 7 yes votes and 1 no.
Thank you.
Well, to clarify, that gets forwarded on to the City Council.
Mr. Chair, since it's 7 p.m., can we take a little break?
Yes, and since we have to use the elevator to get to the restrooms, we'll do a 10-minute break. So we will come back at 7:07.
should at least discuss it to make sure that everybody's clear on that intent, because they were saying their intent was the other way. One that is a resident.
We'll go ahead and get started again. Our next item is subdivision code amendment.
Christensen.
Case number PLN PCM 2023-000494.
I'd like to make a motion that we go back and discuss a couple more questions about, I know we just forwarded it, but before making a motion to reconsider, then a discussion, because there are some additional questions that, as I've reviewed the staff materials during our break, just a couple more questions I think need to be answered. Is it possible?
Mr. Chair, can I ask that we have Commissioner Gill repeat that in her microphone, because I couldn't hear any of that.
Yes, just a question before I consider a motion to reconsider, if we can have a little bit of a discussion regarding a question that came up for me as I reviewed the staff's, as I reviewed the amended ordinance language during the break.
For the daycare.
For which item?
Yes, for the daycare.
Daycare, okay.
I think
So I guess my motion would be, can we open a discussion on the daycare item?
I'm going to defer to council on how we handle this.
No, we would need to reopen the matter
Yeah, so
to have a discussion.
our only option would
Okay.
be to make a motion and have it seconded, and then we'd vote on whether or not to reopen it.
So the motion needs to be to reopen the discussion or to reconsider the vote?
I believe it's just to reconsider.
Okay. So I'd like to make a motion that we reconsider the immediately prior vote on the daycare center issue.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second, or a motion from Commissioner Gale and a second from Commissioner Scheer to reopen our prior daycare text amendments discussion. We'll go ahead and vote. Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle,
No.
Commissioner Barry,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer,
Yes.
Commissioner Bitten,
No.
Commissioner Santos Rivera,
No.
and the chair will vote yes. That motion passes 5-3. So we will now reopen our discussion regarding text amendments to daycare uses. Case number PLN PCM 2020. Case number PLN PCM 2019-00225.
So what's the issue?
So,
Wait for the questions.
yes, go ahead with your questions.
Oh, well, so I thought when we were discussing about it before, I thought I understood when you walked us through the ordinance, but as I was looking at it during the break, I thought, I'm not sure I got every step through this. So I want to start first. My understanding, based on our discussion previously, was that the intent of everyone here is that the first home occupation daycare, licensed home daycare, is that the correct term? Licensed home daycare,
Correct.
must be a use that is accessory to the primary residential use.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, So let me go through and ask my questions, and hopefully we can get there if we can keep all of it, if I can keep all of it straight, if anybody can keep all of it straight. So on page 16, under the definition of home occupation, which we know defines many other occupations, right? Licensed home daycares are exempt from having the business be accessory to the residential use and may function as the principal use, but must be located in a building intended for residential use. So the interpretation of that is, I don't want to make legal conclusions for people. I just looked at that, and at the plain reading, it sounds like licensed home daycares are exempt from having a primary residential use at that point.
Yes, in the definition.
Okay. Do you want to point to where we go next from there? That's totally fine with me, because I may miss something.
Go to the home daycares section, the very beginning.
On page, oh, right above it?
I am finding it right now.
22 of the staff report.
Go to page 19.
19?
Yeah.
18, 19. Thank you for doing this. I know this is tedious. Okay, so
we look at the purpose statement and what exactly is a home occupation.
So we're talking about this section establishes regulations for home occupations in all residential districts and within legal conforming single-family, duplex, and multifamily dwellings within all commercial and non-residential districts, and to ensure that home occupations are compatible with the district in which they are located. Do not negatively impact. That's it, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay. So then we're looking down to,
Let's keep going.
is it maybe
Hold on.
D4 talks about daycare, but I don't think it's the question we're looking at.
No.
So the next thing I have is, unless somebody else has something prior, is G, the general standards,
Correct.
where it says licensed home daycares are exempt from the following standards. And the first one that they're exempt from is that it's clearly, that the home occupation is clearly incidental and secondary. So it exempts them from that requirement. And then if we go down to age, this might be the missing piece. Maybe allowed permitted use within legal. Commercial,
So can I ask a question?
yeah.
Is the ultimate question here making sure that there's something in our code that clarifies that at least the first home daycare has to be owner occupied?
That's the fundamental
So
question. Thank
my
you, Nick.
suggestion would be that under H has a number 2 that we simply just add that the first home daycare must be in a dwelling that's occupied by the operator of the daycare, right?
Yes.
Let's-
Something like that
So
would be
I
great.
think that if that helps address that, then we can modify the motion to clarify that language to make sure that that language that's up in G that is otherwise exempt for the owner being
Yep.
living on site, that it's added here for the first.
Okay.
All right.
So do we need a motion to approve this item again?
Yes, we need a motion.
I-
Since- oh, go ahead.
Okay. I did not mean to step on your toes. All right, Chair, I will so move that, you should probably do it because you might have the motion sheet up in front of you.
I don't think it's a
That based on the information presented in discussion, we, what's the language?
We recommend that the city council approve.
We recommend that the city council approve this language. However, the city staff must work, well, they're all city staff and the city attorney's office, the planning office and the attorney's office must work to include language, making it clear that the first licensed home day care
Yes.
must be an ancillary use to a primary residential use.
I'll second that.
We have a motion from Commissioner Gale and a second from Commissioner Scheer. Any discussion to the motion? We'll go ahead and vote. Commissioner Santos Rivera.
Yes.
Commissioner Scheer.
Yes.
Commissioner Barry.
No.
Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
Commissioner Bitten.
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
Commissioner Gale.
Yes.
And the chair will also vote yes. That recommendation is forwarded with 7 yes votes and 1 no vote. Now we will go ahead and move on to our third item, subdivision code amendment. Case number PLN PCM 2023-00494. And our planner is Nick Norris.
Thank you. So this is a follow-up public hearing and presentation to the briefing that the commission held last month about this proposal. This is a little modified presentation, so we're going to just kind of jump into it, but these are the main things that we're going to talk about. You've already heard this stuff, so in the interest of time, basically a subdivision, it regulates how land is divided, how property lines are established, modified, changed over time, how public improvements are installed, and a bunch of other things. It's a fairly complex and very technical process. One of the things that comes up frequently with subdivisions is who pays for what happens. And we want to make sure that everyone's aware that it's the subdivider's responsibility to pay for and construct all required public improvements. And this proposal includes a list of what those public improvements are. You can see them on your screen. Obviously, there's a lot of detail involved in those as far as engineering standards, etc. We are making these changes because of a state law that was adopted by the legislature this last session, earlier this year. And so we are required to update our code to address some things. We also want to reorganize our current code so it makes more sense in terms of how it flows. We feel like we need to update application requirements so we can guarantee that all the standards are complied with. We're modifying some of those design standards to align with city goals and master plans. We're eliminating some of the outdated standards, and we're clarifying some of the existing regulations. So new state code requirements, we have to have a checklist of all application materials that have to also cite where in the code those are required. That's the same for all standards. There's also requirements for review cycles and review times for any subdivision that involves a single family, 2-family, or townhome development. We don't do a lot of single family and 2-family subdivisions, but we do a lot of townhome subdivisions. And so that's going to be where this impacts the city the most. Review comments that we provide during those 4 review cycles have to be itemized. They have to list specifically what's deficient. They have to state any missing information, and they have to reference the section of code that we're requiring the deficiency or review comment. After 4 review cycles, the city has no choice but to accept what the proposal is. The intent behind that is we get 4 times to review to find any missing information. That should be enough, and it's time to move forward. There are very few exceptions to that, including some life safety types of things that are in state code that would apply as well. There is an onus put on the subdivider as well. They must respond to each review comment. So we give them a list of 20 deficiencies. They have to respond to all 20 of those before it triggers the next review cycle. If they don't, they stay in the same review cycle. And the state code requires us to have an appeal process. We already have it, but we're clarifying how that works. I wanted to go over a short version of what the approval process looks like. In Salt Lake City, we have a 2-step process, both preliminary and final. Preliminary is really what essentially entitles a subdivision. So it's usually doesn't require nearly as much information, And basically it goes through a review for completeness. It gets routed to all of the city departments that have a role in it. That's also when we send out a public notice. We don't have public hearings for subdivisions in Salt Lake City unless it's associated with another land use application that's required by the zoning code to have a public hearing. And so you'll oftentimes, and you may be familiar with this with the plan development, there may also be a subdivision approval associated with that because we can't approve the subdivision unless the plan development is approved. Once we get all the comments back or any sort of issues raised during a public notice period, list of corrections goes out to the applicant. If they comply with all standards, they get approved. This is just an example of some of the department review things that are looked at. Obviously, Public Utilities looks at a number of things, not just water, sewer, stormwater, but also flood control. Our transportation department looks at both connectivity and street design standards. The planning division and also sustainability looks at the natural features. Sometimes Parks and Public Lands is involved in that too. And then we review to make sure the block standards and the lot standards are complied with. Some of these design standards are new. Really the protection of natural features. We have steep slope standards right now. And in our zoning code, we have riparian corridor overlay that protects the lands in between our rivers up to a certain distance away from the high water line of those rivers. The subdivision code adds some more requirements. I believe you went through these prior, but it's things like if there's a plan, a community plan or the general plan that identifies an area that needs to be protected, unique landscape feature or geologic features, things like that, that they need to identify those on their plat and mark those as undevelopable areas. The image on the screen is an example of this up in the foothill zone that includes not only steep slopes but also some rock fall areas where they have some areas up slope from these properties where there's known to be rock slides, and so they have to provide a fall area for those. Let's move on. So what happens at the approval process with preliminary is that it authorizes the subdivider to proceed to actually go through the process of subdividing their property. So the next steps would be to develop their public improvement plans. They enter into a public improvement construction agreement with the city that outlines all public improvements that have to be installed, that it's at the subdivider's expense, and that there's a warranty period once that infrastructure is turned over to the city. They also can go through with their final plat application. The preliminary approval does have an expiration date if they haven't submitted their final plat application in a certain amount of time. This is a visual reference of what that means for the final process. This is where our 4 review cycles kick in. And the reason why our review cycles kick in here is because that's when the public improvement plans and the bulk of the technical review is done. And that's the intent of the state laws, to have those review cycles apply to that. Our preliminary stuff is rather simple in review and not as detailed. Not every city does it that way. Sometimes some cities put all of this information up front. But Salt Lake City has decided to put this after preliminary approval, probably just to save some time on the upfront and some costs on the upfront. This is what a preliminary plat looks like. Pretty basic. Not all of them have the signature blocks on here, and I'm showing you this so you can take a mental image of it, because when we get to the final plat, they're much more significant in detail. This is what a final plat looks like. You can see there's a lot more information on there. Everything on here is required by code, down to the signature blocks, the title, the surveyor information, the owner's dedication, all the notary acknowledgments, any notes. All of this stuff is required by code to be on the plat. This summarizes that whole process from preliminary to the public improvements and then on to the final plat. with those steps included in there. There are other subdivision processes. All of these, except for the street dedication plats, are actually already in our code. Subdivision amendments essentially follow the same process as creating a new subdivision. You're just looking at usually a smaller portion of that subdivision that's being amended. Sometimes they're amended by adding new lots. Sometimes it's changing a dimension of something. If there's anything on a subdivision, a recorded plat that somebody wants to come in and amend or change, they go through that amendment process. The only exception to that is that in Salt Lake City, we allow people to consolidate lots within subdivisions without amending their subdivision, and the county recorder office accepts those. So we have condo conversions. That's converting an existing building to condo ownership. That is not just residential in nature, it's also commercial. There's a whole process for that. We aren't changing that much except references to different sections of the condominium code in the state law. Then we have lot line adjustments and lot consolidations. I'm using that term. In state law, lots and parcels are different. And so as I use that, it's applying to both. But a lot line adjustment is moving the boundaries of your lots. Both property owners or multiple property owners have to agree to that. Under state code, when they're parcels, we have to approve those within 14 days, I believe it is. And same with some of the consolidations. In fact, some consolidations don't even require local approval if it doesn't involve residential uses. Doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to have future land use approvals, but somebody can go consolidate parcels and lots without city approval. Street dedication plats, this is one from a long time ago involving Immigration Canyon Road on here, but basically a street dedication plat is when somebody is running a new street, dedicating a new street, usually all on their property and usually on one of the boundaries of their property line, so it's not creating new lots. And that's the end of my presentation. The one thing I will add is that late today after 5 o'clock, we did receive a letter from the Sugar House Community Council. It's in your Dropbox. They identified, they have 3 concerns with it. The first is that they think they don't support staff level approvals of subdivisions. And I can't remember the other 3. One of them had to do with something that's required by state code that we can't do anything about anyway. But you can look at that and run through it, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thanks, Nick, and I appreciate the work that went into this. I also appreciate the new emphasis on some of the design components. How many subdivisions would you say you approve on a staff level?
In 2022, we had 175 subdivision applications. That includes lot line adjustments, consolidations, all of them.
How many of them were like more than 5 or 10 lots or something like that?
Well, the ones that were probably townhomes, where they had maybe 20 or 30 townhomes. They're relatively small overall subdivisions. Most of the new subdivisions we do are in the industrial area of the city. And so they have a lot of land area, but they're usually like 20, 30 acre lots.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I just have 2 questions. Can you tell me how this impacts the RMF 30 changes that were approved last year?
Yeah, so this proposal doesn't impact any zoning code. So, in fact, one of the review standards for all subdivisions is that they comply with all applicable zoning. So there's no impact to those, anything in the zoning code.
Okay, that answers my second question too.
Thanks.
Hey Nick, I cannot find that message that you were referring to. Would you mind pointing me to that folder?
It should be in the subdivision folder. Hopefully.
Yeah, it's not showing up there.
Dropped it in there during this meeting. I opened it at
You're
about
good.
5:30. So hope.
It's not showing up.
All right, let me open it.
It's all right. Would you mind like reiterating what you were saying about what this letter contains again?
Yeah. So basically, what it says is they feel like there should be some public input into administrative decisions, and that some things should go to the Planning Commission. So it lists subdivisions, lot lines, parcel, lot line adjustments and consolidations. So their general recommendation or request is that there be some form of public input into those decisions, and they feel like the Planning Commission should have some oversight. That relates to the second comment, which says there are no public hearing required for the proposed subdivisions, and while it's current practice, it's not enough public oversight for people who live in neighborhoods. We should want more public engagement, not less. And then 3, the state mandated review times mean some projects will go to the head of the line, which is absolutely true. While this is probably unavoidable, it is nonetheless not an optimal situation. We'd agree with that, but there's not much we can do about it because it's state required.
Thank you, Nick. Can you please, under the subdivision design standards, can you please elaborate more about what the protection of natural features means? And under that note, can you please walk us through what the standards for blocks, what all of that is in relationship to each subdivision? I just want to make sure I'm understanding those two correctly.
Yeah, let me get to that section of the code. 1 second. So what the subdivision standard says that is all subdivisions and subdivision amendments shall be designed to preserve the natural features of a site as follows. So the site is the entire area that's proposed to be subdivided. So it includes rivers, streams, and creeks. It prohibits them from being piped or placed in any culvert. So the whole idea is to maintain that our riparian corridors and our rivers has rivers and not aqueducts and pipes. Wetlands shall be protected and buffered as required within the underlying zoning or as identified in a general plan. So if we have a general plan that identifies some wetland area that needs some buffering, that subdivision would have to address that. There's also a similar requirement for wooded areas. So that would have to be something that is identified in a general plan. So like for example, even though most of our foothills are protected, if we have somebody coming in with a 2 or 3 lot, relatively small subdivision, and some of those a significant portion of that area is scrub oak, then they'd have to preserve a certain amount of that scrub oak when the general plan identifies that. Wildlife habitat is very similar in that, and then it basically says that natural features that are identified have to be marked as undevelopable areas on the final plat. So that's something that we do right now with steep slopes. This expands that to other areas.
Thank you, Nick.
And you said you had a question about the standards for blocks.
Yeah, will that be ours? Like the standards that we have, or what is? I guess I don't know what the.
So basically, what this right now, our definition of block is kind of. I'm going to say it's kind of outrageous because it defines a block as the perimeter of the subdivision, which is very unusual. Usually, a block is, land bounded on all sides by streets. So we're fixing that, and one of the unique things that we are adding in here is that we are putting block requirements in, so that subdivisions, if it's in a zoning district that allows residential subdivision or residential uses, and that subdivision is over 5 acres, they need to break that into blocks. So they need to add streets to do that. That doesn't apply like in our industrial areas, our open space zones, where it's not unusual for us to have very large lots. if that helps explain that.
No, yeah, it does. It clarifies actually quite a lot. Thank you so much.
So do the natural conditions apply to, say, the inland port?
They could.
They could.
Yeah, it
They
depends on
do.
where and it depends on what's there. Some of the land that's within the inland port overlay is subject to development agreements that that lock them into regulations that existed at that time, including subdivisions. So that may not, but if there's proposals for land that is not subject to those development agreements, then they could be subject to those.
But my understanding is that most of the inland port is subject to
Well,
previous
probably
agreements.
within Salt Lake City, roughly half of that land is in those two development agreements north of I-80. The rest of the inland port land is outside of that.
Okay, thank you.
This is very ticky-tacky, but there are a couple of places that reference submitting digital files, and then it will say in a size of not less than 24 by 36. Yeah, like on the sheet. You might just want to look at that because
So that's actually, we do that because as of right now, we're still that Mylar still has to be printed to that size, and we want to make sure that the scale right. And so when we do our review, it's actually, we can line those up if they're on the same size of paper.
yeah.
So that's why we
Yeah, you might think about it, putting it in terms of scale or in terms of, I don't know, a file size or
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, until the county recorder's office starts accepting digital plats, digital signatures, it has to be printed on that size, so that's the size we go with.
Okay. It just is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you're saying a digital file, then somebody could be like, it's a digital file. I don't have to give you a piece of paper. So.
Not all digital files are equal.
I know. That's
Some
part
I
of the
can barely
problem.
read. I'd like to make a motion.
We need to have a public hearing first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I'd love the.
Yes, we'll get to that in just a second. Also, Commissioner Burrows needs to step out early, so we will excuse her. But yes, let's go ahead and open up the public hearing. Do we have anyone who would like to give comment on this? I don't see anyone, and we don't have any emails, so we will go ahead and close the public hearing, and we can now have a motion.
Mr. Chair, based on the information presented and the discussion, I move that the commission forward a recommendation to adopt this code amendment petition to the city council.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Scheer and a second from Commissioner Burrows. Any discussion to the motion?
Sorry, actually, that was Commissioner Gale.
Oh, excuse me.
Gale, that was
That
me.
was seconded by Commissioner Gale.
I do have one comment on that. So when we were looking at the street design standards, we noticed, so there's some requirements for certain size of public improvements that are listed by zoning district. And we left some of the zoning districts, got omitted from that. So I would like to request that as part of the motion, you give us that authority to add those districts to make sure we're good.
That is so we shall add the zoning districts as indicated. It's a friendly amendment.
And I will second that amendment.
Thank you.
That amendment, or that friendly amendment is accepted. We'll go ahead and take a vote. Commissioner Barry.
Yes.
Commissioner Gale.
Yes.
Commissioner Santos Rivera.
No.
No. Commissioner Scheer.
Yes.
Commissioner Tuttle.
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows.
Yes.
Commissioner Bitten.
Yes.
And the chair will also vote yes. That recommendation is forwarded with a vote of 7 yeses and 1 no. And now Commissioner Burrows is going to officially head out. We'll move on to the briefing section of the meeting. Our first briefing will be Salt SLC Ballpark Station Area Rezones briefing. Case number PLN PCM 2023-00169, and our planner is Brooke Olson.
Good evening, Commission. Okay, tonight I will be briefing the Commission on the Salt Lake City Ballpark Station Area Rezone Proposal. No action is required tonight. The purpose of this presentation is just to introduce the proposal, gather feedback, and answer questions. So during the presentation, I'll go over the project background and process, the project objective, as well as a summary of the proposal. The mayor initiated this petition to implement the recommendations in the Ballpark Station Area Plan and rezone properties within the boundaries of the plan. The proposal consists of zoning map and zoning text amendments to establish a new zone, MU8, Form-Based Mixed-Use District 8, and implement the zone in the Ballpark Station area. To give you some background, the Ballpark Station Area Plan is a small area community plan encompassing the properties between 900 South and 1700 South and State Street to I-15. The plan was adopted in October 2022 and includes a future land use map and descriptions to guide future development and land use decisions. The city is proposing to rezone properties in 4 future land use areas specified in the plan, including a portion of the heart of the neighborhood, the Jefferson Park mixed use area, and a portion of the Main Street and State Street areas. The project area is predominantly zoned a variety of commercial zones, public lands, and multifamily residential zones, the majority of which do not provide the density, development standards, uses, or urban design elements specified in the plan. Therefore, the city is proposing the zoning map and text amendments to implement the recommendations. So next, I'll just touch on each future land use area and the recommendations for each zone. So first, the heart of the neighborhood. The plan indicates this area should consist of high-density mixed-use development with ground floor active uses, community centers, gathering spaces, public parking, and public transportation facilities. The plan indicates that high-density development up to 10 stories in height is appropriate in this area, and also specifies a number of urban design and right-of-way improvements for future development, including expanded sidewalks and park strips, design quality and visual interests, and additional green space. The majority of this area is predominantly zoned a variety of commercial zoning districts, as well as some small areas of moderate density multifamily residential, RMF 35, residential business, residential mixed use, and some large areas of public land zoning, including the ballpark parking, and Horizonte. The city is proposing to rezone a large portion of the area to MU8, Form-Based Mixed-Use District 8, and some smaller areas to Form-Based Urban Neighborhood 1, FBUN1, at the northwest corner of the boundary, and then some areas of Form-Based Urban Neighborhood 2, along that same area, as well as the southern portion of Main Street. The city is also proposing a small area of public land zoning on the south side of 1400 South, which is the future library site. And the city is proposing to preserve a small R1 5000 zone along Merrimack Avenue, which consists of an established single-family neighborhood, as well as the zoning of the ballpark facility and the ballpark north parking lot, which is zone PL and RMF 35. The zoning of the ballpark properties will be considered in a second phase of this proposal in early 2024 to align with the ballpark next community visioning process. The city is proposing the associated zoning text amendments to establish the new zone, MU8. So next I'll just touch on the standards of the MU8 zone. The MU8 zone is a high-density form-based mixed-use zone that allows for buildings up to 8 stories in height and a wide variety of uses, including residential and office, commercial, parks, open space, government, education, and institutional uses, just to name a few. The standards of the zone are form-based standards with a focus on massing, scale, and building placement. with an aim to facilitate pedestrian-friendly and engaging development and mitigate high-density impacts on adjacent properties. The forms established in the zone include row houses, multifamily, storefront, and vertical mixed use, which I'll just refer to as other forms. Some of the general regulations of the zone include a maximum building height of 40 feet for row houses and 90 feet for other building forms. It's important to note that developments over 50 feet in height are subject to the design review process and will require review and approval from the Planning Commission. As far as open space, the zone requires that 25% of the footprint of the individual dwelling unit be open space for row houses, and then a minimum of 20% of the lot area be dedicated to open space for all other forms. The zone also includes a number of open space design requirements to ensure that vegetation is included in the area and that the space is usable. As far as yard and setback requirements, the zone requires larger interior side and rear yard setbacks for row houses, and then for all other forms, the setbacks are minimal. However, for all building forms, a minimum front setback of 10 feet is required. And there are also greater setback requirements for properties abutting lower density zones. The zone requires a minimum sidewalk width of 10 feet along the property frontage and requires that 80% of the ground floor of the street-facing facades consist of a permitted ground floor use. There are specific use requirements to ensure the ground floor is activated, and mailroom or leasing offices cannot count towards the requirement. The zone also includes a number of design standards as shown on the slide. Some of them are entry feature requirements, upper level facade stepbacks adjacent to lower density zones, durable building materials, as well as minimum gloss requirements, building entrance requirements, and the maximum length of street-facing facades is limited to 200 feet. As far as the city's parking requirements are concerned, they vary by the context area of the zone and the land use of the site. The MU8 zone would be in the transit context, which includes zones that immediately surround mass transit or are located in the downtown core. These areas have the lowest parking demand and require minimal parking or may be exempt from minimum parking requirements. So next, I'll touch on FBUM1 zone requirements, since that is also proposed in this area. The zone allows for a variety of small-scale residential uses, as well as uses generally associated with residential developments. The standards are based on the forms established in the zone, including urban house, two-family dwellings, cottage developments, and row houses. Some of the general development regulations include a maximum building height of 30 feet, a 10% open space requirement. The setbacks are more typical of residential zones with larger front, corner side, and rear yard setbacks and smaller interior side yards. The zone also has a number of design standards, including durable building materials, ground floor gloss, open space design standards, and maximum length of street-facing facades. The slide also shows some examples of existing developments within the FBUN1 zone in the Central Ninth community. So next, I'll touch on Form-Based Urban Neighborhood 2, which is also proposed for this area. The zone allows for a wide variety of residential uses as well as other types of uses such as office, commercial and retail services, community centers and gathering spaces, and government and education and institutional uses. The development standards are also based on the forms established in the zone, including cottage developments, row houses, multifamily residential, mixed use, and storefront. Some of the general regulations of the zone include a maximum building height of 50 feet, a 10% open space requirement, as well as the open space design standards to ensure the space is usable. The setbacks are larger for residential uses and minimal for other uses, but they are increased if the properties are adjacent to lower density zones. And there have been some recent text amendments to the FBUN2 zones to address some of the issues identified in the Central Ninth community. The amendments increase the design standards and ground floor use requirements, as well as the open space standards, and also increase setback requirements. So next, I'll touch on the recommendations for State Street and Main Street. The plan indicates that these areas should consist of a mix of uses, including housing, restaurants, and retail services. The plan indicates that higher density development is appropriate north of 1300 South, while more moderate density development is appropriate south of 1300 South. The area is predominantly zoned commercially with some public land zoning, and the South State Street Corridor overlay is also located in this area. The overlay was created to acknowledge and reinforce the historical land development patterns along South State Street and includes some specific building and design standards for street-facing facades. Staff is proposing to rezone the northern portion of this area to MU8 and the southern portion to FBUN2. Staff is not proposing any modifications to the overlay and is also proposing to preserve the existing zoning of the ballpark, which is Zone PL. And finally, Jefferson Park mixed-use area. The plan indicates this area should contain a mix of uses and building scales, specifically that higher density mixed-use development is appropriate along 200 West and West Temple, and medium density residential development should be focused on the areas adjoining Jefferson Street and the Avenue Streets. The project area is predominantly zoned multifamily residential, RMF 35, with some smaller areas of commercial corridor, residential mixed use, and the open space zoning of Jefferson Park. Staff is proposing form-based urban neighborhood 1 on the interior of the blocks along the Avenue Streets and Jefferson Street, FBUN2 on the exterior of the blocks along 200 West and West Temple, and is also proposing to preserve the open space zoning of Jefferson Park, as well as the RMU zoned properties, since those have been developed with multifamily residential uses and are not likely to be redeveloped in the near future. As far as public input, the initial public input period began on June 2nd, and since that time, staff received a number of email comments and phone calls. On July 13th, staff presented the proposal at the Ballpark and Central 9th Community Council meetings and received additional input. Between July and August, some significant modifications were made to the proposal in response to the input received. And in September, staff presented the proposal modifications at the Ballpark Community Council meeting, and overall the public voiced support for the modifications. On September 8th, the 45-day public input period began for the proposal modification, and we have a public engagement event scheduled next Monday in the Ballpark neighborhood, which unfortunately we had to postpone. It was scheduled earlier. And then we have a tentative public hearing date at the end of October or early November with the recommendation to the City Council. So we do have one question for the Commission. As we have been making modifications to the proposal. So it is the proposed zoning of the small parcels along Lucy Avenue and Paxton Avenue appropriate? Staff had originally proposed some higher density zoning for this area. And the area does consist of small scale single family dwellings with small lot sizes that range from about 3,000 to 5,000 square feet. And staff received several concerns from the public regarding the high density for the smaller parcels. However, these properties are adjacent to the tracks, and the plan indicates this area is appropriate for high density. But we did make some modifications based on the public input and are proposing FBUN1 for the interior parcels on the block, and then FBUN2 for the properties fronting 200 West and West Temple, similar to what's being proposed for the Jefferson Park mixed-use area. So that concludes my presentation, and I am happy to take any questions or comments.
So under the affordable housing, it's not called overlay anymore, but amendments that are under consideration by council, there would be, I'm going to talk about the MU8 zone because I'm very interested when we establish a new zone to get it right. Because I'm very concerned about, I'm concerned about the MU8 receiving zone. And so one of the things that's been happening is, in a lot of cases where we incentivize affordable housing, which is the right thing to do, but then we allow a zone where it's already pretty much over what the market can bear, and therefore the incentive doesn't work as well. So I would think that one of the things we might do is not have it be by right so tall. In other words, bring it down to 70 feet or something, and then only allow it to go up if affordable housing is allowed. Because in my opinion, 70 feet is pretty tall anyway. It's pretty extensive. I'm not sure 70 feet is the right number, especially with a 14-foot. But somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 stories instead of 8. So we can go up to 8 with affordable housing incentives, not with any other kind of approval, just affordable housing, not just conditional use, which was, oh yeah, it's got housing in it, so we'll have to approve it. But really affordable housing incentive. And that makes the affordable housing incentives more desirable for a developer to do. So that would be one thing I would really look at. The other thing that I think to incentivize affordable housing in that zone. So the other thing that I would be concerned about is the design review. Well, there's a couple things. One other thing is the design review, and I am wondering if it is similar or the same as the standards that we were looking at for the building today, for example, the 3rd East building. It's the same.
Yeah, it would be the same process. And as far as the affordable housing incentives are concerned, we did take that into consideration when we were making this proposal. And the plan actually calls for buildings up to 10 stories in height. So that would be between like 110 to 125 feet in height. So we decided to limit the height of this zone just so that the affordable housing incentives could be implemented in this area, and the same goes for the other areas that call for more moderate density. They do indicate that more height should be located in those areas, but we're limiting it to 4 stories for the FBUN2 areas instead of 5 to 7 stories as what the plan calls for, just so that the affordable housing incentives can be implemented in those areas.
That's very good input. Okay. So the design standards are the same standards, or they are? Okay.
They would be the same standards.
Okay, because I would like to make a suggestion that at least one of these design standards be eliminated, the one which requires things to go in and out and be in stripes. That that's causing a lot of our stuff to just look really terribly ugly. So I think that I can't remember which standard it is, but I can look it up in a second here and tell you. But the project today would have been so much better without all of that in and out and mess, changing of materials sort of arbitrarily. I mean, it's just, it's a standard that makes no sense from design perspective. If it's not, when you're already 20 feet in the air, you're not pedestrian oriented anymore. You're city oriented. So that, it's not, I'm not at you, I'm at the world here right now. So, sorry. Okay. So I really, that's a design standard I would like to change citywide. But we can have that discussion later, perhaps. But I think that one is very damaging to the look of our city. And also, we are in the habit of approving reductions in landscaping. So I want to make sure that we are in the right so this seems to allow all of the landscaping to be privately, to be on the deck of some parking garage somewhere. Is that true? I mean, it doesn't say it has to be on the ground. It has, not all of it. I mean, the street frontage, the street trees, yes, but otherwise you can cover the land with a building. I mean, it doesn't really say that anything has to be like on the ground. And I really would like to see us be a little bit more serious about open spaces that are on the ground, that can have trees, that people can use, and that are not necessarily closed off visually, at least, to the public.
I'll take a look at that, and the language is actually not loading for some reason. So I don't know if management has
I would be
that pulled up.
happy to have less landscaping if it were all required to be on the ground level.
No, we did look, Nick's got it pulling up, so I think it does look like we, as right now as open space, we are counting like balconies, like private space. We're not, or it's a common
No,
balcony.
we don't
sorry,
count balconies, but I think we do count spaces like on the top of a parking garage.
Yes.
Okay. These are more complaints about all of the zones than it is about this specific zone. Where, in fact, all the comments I made, including reducing the height of things, which really could apply to all the mixed-use zones that we have as a particular correction to those things. Thank you.
Okay, I have some questions about to compare some of these zones. So can you remind me what is the height limit and the lot coverage for an RMU zone?
For just the RMU,
Yeah.
residential mixed use. So the RMU zone allows for a building height of 75 feet. I don't believe it has specific coverage requirements or minimum lot requirements. And it doesn't have any density requirements either.
Okay, so I am looking a little bit more expanded in relation to Lucy to Mead, right? If we look at that entire block, is the reason along Mead and Goltz we're leaving those RMU because there's a building currently on them as RMU, or why are we not including that to make some uniformity?
Yeah, so we decided to just preserve that RMU zoning since those buildings have been developed with multifamily uses and they're not likely to be redeveloped in the near future.
How is then that RMU different if you did a multifamily and an FBUN too?
The RMU zone allows for much higher density than FBUN 2. The building height is 75 feet in comparison to 50 feet. And you actually can get some more density out of FBUN 2 as well, because it does not have lot coverage requirements either. And the setbacks are more minimal for that zone, but that's something we can take into consideration is including those as well.
Mr. Chair, I'd also add that the RMU zone, at least how it's currently written, has virtually no sort of like design standards or anything like that, whereas the form-based zones are really catered towards how those streets acknowledge, or how those buildings acknowledge the street. So it's a completely different approach than the RMU zone.
Thank you. One of the things that and will come up in one of the other briefings later in my notes, was kind of when we do future land use maps that we actually make a map that is really regarding the future we want to see, not necessarily the status quo. So I think you've done that in a lot of places, but I question if you really want to keep those as RMU just because they're there now and they're not likely to be developed. That's great, like they don't have to be redeveloped, but if we're taking this opportunity, I think we should really look at what do we want to see in the future? Doesn't mean that it's what's there now. So, okay, so I am really curious about this whole section. So let me just kind of talk through. So we're changing a lot of this RMF 35 to FBUN1, and the main difference seems to be height. In the FBUN1, we would have 30 feet. As height is there, but does it allow more density?
Yeah, so it does allow some slightly more density than the RMF 35 zone. The RMF 35 zone allows for a building height of 35 feet, and it has some pretty large lot area requirements for all types of building forms permitted in that zone. The FBUN1 zone also does have some design standard requirements, so that includes like durable building materials, glazing, but as far as density is concerned, you can get a couple more units out of FBUN1 just because the lot size requirements are about half of what's required for RMF 35.
Right, but if you own one, we would probably see like townhomes or
Yes.
a
Mhm.
duplex, triplex, fourplex.
Yep.
Okay, so then in relation to how you've proposed to go to FPUN2 along the tracks line, I'm not convinced, but I'm also not adamantly opposed to it, that is the right area for that kind of concentration, because that road is like really narrow. I mean, we've packed a lot into that street, and it's not necessarily a street that can handle a lot of ingress egress due to the nature of just the way it's configured. So I mean, I would ask maybe a little bit better reflection along that in regards to the FPUN2, that it can accommodate that kind of density and height. I'm not sure that that's a great divider line. We might want to consider keeping that FPUN1. And yeah, and then just overall, I like how we're not patching things together as much. You know, in a nice color palette, it's getting a little bit more simple in terms of how we look at zoning, and I appreciate that. So I do, though, you know, where we have some zoning here, just because that's what exists, I really would like staff to kind of go back and be like, is that what we want to see in the next maybe 30 years? We might want to see something different, because we know how long these plans are in effect. Long after us, they don't get changed very often. So let's do this to reflect what we really want to see, not necessarily what's there. Okay. And thanks for your hard work on this. This is good.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask about the parking requirements in the zones.
Yeah. So the MU8 zone, and I'll come back to one of the slides. Oh, I think I skipped over it. Sorry. Okay. The MU8 zone, as well as the FBUN2 zone, are located in the transit context. And the FBUN1 zone is in the neighborhood context. The transit context has very minimal, if any, parking requirements. And that's because these zones and areas immediately surround mass transit or are located in the downtown. The neighborhood context does have some parking requirements. It's for FBUN1 zones, for the residential units, it's about 1 space per unit for all of those building forms.
I'd just like to add the comment that I think we should be aiming for as minimal parking as possible in this community. So I'd like to see that reflected in future planning.
Thank you.
If we don't have any further questions, thank you for the briefing. And we'll go ahead and move on to the next item, which is the final item on the agenda. General Plan and Zoning Amendments, Community Benefit Ordinance, case number PLN PCM 2023-00535. And our planner is Chrissy Gilmore.
All right, there we go. Okay, well, thank you for having me. Good evening. So just for, my shyness, it's hard for me. Okay, so just for some background. So these amendments we're going to talk about today came about through Thriving in Place, which is the city's anti-displacement strategy. And that strategy and the work on that began in 2021, in the fall of 2021. And it went through extensive public input and research and eventually it found that displacement is significantly getting worse in Salt Lake City. And I'm sure they're what's considered no more affordable neighborhoods in the city. And then there are just not enough housing units overall. And so based on those findings, Thriving in Place set up a strategy to protect the most vulnerable from displacement, preserve the affordable housing we have, produce more housing, especially affordable, then expand capacity for tenants, partner and collaborate, and then advocate for tenants. And so these amendments address 4 things from Thriving in Place, and these were tasks that the Planning Division was given within that document to combat displacement. And they are establish a community benefit policy, create a tenant relocation assistance program, require housing replacement, and then require data on housing. And then as we get into the proposed amendments, I'll just say to start that these apply to legislative processes. So that means that by opting into, if a property owner is opting into a higher development density, that is when these will come into play. It doesn't apply to things like a planned development or a subdivision or conditional use or those by right or any by right developments. It's only general plan or zoning, map, or text amendments. So the first one is Title 19. So this is the first major initiative, and it's a new title that will determine when it is necessary to update the city's general plan. And the general plan is Plan Salt Lake, and then any of our elemental plans that have a land use component, so all of our neighborhood plans, but this also includes our transportation master plan because it has a land use component with a map. So there's many components of Plan Salt Lake. And then it goes over when that update is necessary, the petition process, and then the framework for both privately initiated petitions and city-initiated petitions. And then the meat of this that people are most interested in is that it now sets up a community benefit policy for implementation, or to implement relocation assistance for displaced tenants, and then the replacement dwelling requirement, and then inclusion of demographic data, and then displacement considerations, which are basically the standards of review. And I'll go over each one of these in a moment in detail. So this is the first part, is Title 19. And then we have Title 21A50, which is our zoning amendments chapter. So this is very similar to what you saw in Title 19, and we were intentionally consistent in the language between the 2 chapters because of sometimes an applicant might be subject to only one process, so we needed the language to be consistent in both places. And this one also has, I don't need to read the list for you, but the same, community benefit and so forth requirements. Okay, and then the third component is Title 18. So Title 18 has our housing loss mitigation ordinance, and this will be deleted through this process and replaced with these amendments in Title 21A and Title 19. And then Title 1864, which is our construction and buildings title, will also be updated to ensure consistency with these regulations. It includes collecting data, more data on what's going on site. So what are the current rents, how many bedrooms with demolition permit applications. Okay, so I'll start with the community benefit policy and go into those details. The community benefit policy requires property owners to provide a community benefit when making both a general plan amendment or a zoning text or map amendment. So applicants are required to provide at least one or more community benefits from a list of 6. So I'll go over the first, and they must also with their application show how that community benefit would not otherwise be available without these amendments and this increase in development potential. So these include housing, the provision of affordable or family-size housing, dedication of publicly accessible open space, support for local businesses, preservation of critical lands, historic building preservation, and then expansion of public infrastructure. And then the proposal also includes several factors to review these for the proposed community benefit. And the factors would include reviewing the proportionality of the benefit proposed compared to the potential increase in density, as well as consideration factors that deal with the specific community benefit, like if publicly accessible open space is proposed, what is the proportion to the size of the lot of that open space? And then ultimately the city council will be the final authority on accepting the community benefit. They could also waive the benefit or modify the benefit in some way. And then the community benefit would be secured through a development agreement.
Can I ask a question about the community
Sure.
benefit? So when does that apply?
It applies for anytime there's a zoning map amendment, text amendment, or a general plan amendment.
Okay, thank you.
And then tenant relocation. So when a petition is likely to result in the demolition of a dwelling unit, the property owner may be required to provide tenant relocation assistance to supplement the cost of leasing a comparable dwelling unit. And so this includes moving expenses up to $1,500, fee assistance, so helping pay those application fees or deposit fees, then rental assistance, which would cover the difference between the current unit's rent and then the replacement unit's rent, with a total cost of not to exceed $7,200. And this would be just a one-time flat payment that's negotiated between the property owner and the tenant. And then relocation. The property owner could also relocate the tenant to a property they already own off-site. And then housing replacement. So the amendment may also require demolished housing units to be replaced at the same rental rate and the same number of bedrooms. The property owner would be required to limit the replacement unit's rent to no more than 3% annual increase over 20 years. And then if the proposal doesn't include residential units on site, then a restrictive covenant could be placed on a dwelling off-site somewhere else in the city to meet this requirement. And then one thing I want to add here is just the overall impact and effectiveness of these amendments and what that will have to address displacement, because I think it really comes into play with this housing replacement. So the loss of existing units to new development is a fairly small contributor to displacement. So according to data gathered from Thriving in Place, it affected less than 1% of housing units in the city between January 2020 and December 2022. So when you put that into perspective for this project, we gathered data on privately initiated general plan and zoning petitions that went before the Planning Commission from January 2020 to September 2023, and it was 63 petitions, and of those 63 petitions, there were 54 residential units that had the potential to be demolished. So just hope that gives you some perspective on this impact. We met with the development community through some roundtables, and they reported that the most likely and where they're seeing displacement is if a unit is remodeled and people are evicted because of remodeling, and then the units are placed back on the market, or just simply through raising rent to a level that's not affordable for those tenants anymore. And then standards for amendments. So new consideration factors were added for review, along with the typical ones that were in code, like does it meet our city plan objectives? There are some new standards that address displacement, and this is assessment of the community benefit that is proposed. Does the amendment have the potential to displace people or businesses? Expanded consideration regarding impact to city services. So there's just more language on impact to water service, on transportation service, and the ability to actually provide those services to the property. And then proximity to amenities, and this includes like fresh food, transportation, schools and parks. And then data collection. So data collection is crucial for analyzing displacement in Salt Lake City and knowing what's happening. And right now Salt Lake City doesn't have the ability to track that. So new requirements through these amendments would be the applicants would be required to provide that information or provide more information when they submit for a general plan or a text or zoning amendment that includes the current rents of the units on size, as well as the size of those units. And then how does this impact new development? So I just put a couple, I'll go to another one, but a couple scenarios to help. Hopefully this helps clarify things, but the first one is the existing zoning is R1 7000, and the proposed zoning is to go to RMF 45. So in this scenario, the applicant would be required to provide tenant relocation assistance because it's likely to displace some housing units, housing relocation, housing replacement, and then also a community benefit. And then in our next scenario, it's going from CN, our neighborhood commercial, to RMF 45. And in this one, because there's likely not residential on site because it's going from commercial, they wouldn't be subject to the tenant relocation or housing replacement. Those only apply to residential units, but they would be subject to providing a community benefit. And then just to cover public engagement, so I mentioned that Thriving in Place has been going on for a while, so we have been doing outreach in a separate manner but related. But there is an online story map that goes over the proposal, and then we had 3 open houses through September and the beginning of October. And then we also held some meetings with the development community, some roundtable discussions at the end of September. And what we heard through those, with the open houses, those really were primarily just answering questions and explaining the proposal, because this is a lot of information for people to digest. Overall, I think the feedback was positive. There were some concerns with adding any red tape to getting units on the ground, because there is a need to get more units, and we don't want to stifle development, is one of the things we heard. And then through the community development roundtable meetings, we did hear concern over that 3% and increase over 20 years, and then that's difficult for the development community to put in their performas, because it's just such a long time frame. And then also they brought up the concern about applicability, and that this really only addresses a small portion of displacement, and it doesn't come into effect when the remodeling and people are displaced that way. So that is all I had. So I'm happy to answer questions, take your feedback. We still are in the middle of our early engagement period. That doesn't end until the end of October, so we'll probably hear more and have stuff to bring back to you.
I'm interested in how this contains kind of a planning bombshell that you haven't spoken about much, which is the whole idea of a new title that requires a lot of things called a general plan. And so that's actually quite different from anything we have now, I think. I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything, and it's great. I mean, I think this is wonderful because we don't have that kind of requirement, as far as I know, other than the state's kind of requirements of comprehensive plan and stuff. But this is where we could codify some of that stuff, like, can you really let a neighborhood plan languish for 25 years without being updated? That would be great if there were some indications of how long the renewal periods for all of these neighborhood plans, which seemed to be kind of, the loudest neighborhood gets the renewed plan or something. I'm not quite sure how the decisions are made surrounding that. And it also sort of might help the city to prioritize planning staff, because they're required to redo plans on a periodic basis. And there might also be part of this where these plans are coordinated from one neighborhood to another, which is also something that I don't think, other than the Plan Salt Lake, which is sort of more of a series of principles than it is a kind of general plan. So for me, there's obviously lots of things having to do with the housing issues, but and I don't have any objections to or much comment on that. But I do think it's important to really note that this kind of introduces a whole new level of planning within the city of Salt Lake.
That's true, and I did gloss over that a bit, and you're correct that one of the reasons we created this new Title 19 is to better comply with state code and the requirements of a general plan. So it does add in those things, the necessary elements of a general plan and what must be included. I don't know if it talks about timeline. I'll look for that. I know state law does have some timeline guidance, but I'm not certain what that is.
So Chrissy, I have some general questions from when I was reading the report. So one of my first questions that came to mind was, how often does a zoning change align with the master plan, so therefore it could skip the general plan amendment?
I would say majority of the time. We went through all of the Planning Commission staff reports since 2020, and I have a spreadsheet that actually shows that data. And I would say probably 3/4 of the time they align with the general plan.
So then 3/4 of the time they could just skip this?
No, they would still, if they're still going through the zoning map amendment, this would still apply to them.
Okay. Okay. And then one of the things that you talk about in here is like relocation assistance if the tenant is offered other lodging. And one of the questions that came to my mind was, do we have parameters for that? Because what if they were offered lodging, in Bountiful or South Jordan, and it's not an area where they want to live, or it's not near their, their support unit, it's not near where they can get around transportation wise, because if they're offered other lodging and they don't take it, then they're not eligible for assistance under this. And so I think we need to really spell out, are they offered other lodging within Salt Lake City?
That's a great point, and that actually was brought up through public involvement as well, and so I have that on my list of things to clarify.
Yeah, I think we need to be pretty clear about that, because if they're then not going to be eligible for any assistance, we can't allow a disparity of like, oh yeah, I can give you lodging, in Clearfield, and then they can't get any assistance when they're like, I can't move to Clearfield. The next question I had, so how would the number 11 point of the consideration facts be evaluated by the Planning Commission? And that is, I'll read it, the potential impacts to any other city service, infrastructure, or resource that may be impacted by the increase in development potential that may result from the proposed amendment. So if that is a consideration factor for us, I have zero idea how we could evaluate that appropriately, because right now those are staff or other departments' reviews, and they're kind of out of our purview. But that certainly then opens up this bailiwick to many comments we get about water. We don't have enough water, we can't do this. So I just wonder how we would have the proper tools or know how to really actually apply that better than public utilities.
Yeah, that's a great point. And like you mentioned, that would largely come through our department review and sending that to public lands and our sustainability division, and then also as the planning division, our research, and then presenting that to you. But
so I mean, well, on one hand, I like the inclusion of this in the consideration factors. I don't know that we're the proper body to do it. Again, you can convince me otherwise. But I would take a look at that again and see if that's really appropriate for us to be including in our factors. And then one of my last questions is, so in one of the areas in D3, you talk about no eviction to avoid obligations. So the landlord can't evict a tenant in order to avoid the obligations that we've set out here. But one of the things that we've seen over time is that oftentimes building owners, aka landlords, will let their building go into complete disrepair. They won't fix it, they won't maintain it, they make it uninhabitable. And we don't discuss that at all here. They could do that to avoid their obligations as well as evict somebody to try and not, do that. And so I think we should look at how we might address that happening, because we know it happens. We've seen it. It's happening. It's happened before. It's happening now. It'll happen in the future. To try to promote the care of those buildings as well, so that they don't become uninhabitable in the hope that, oh, well, I'll just demolish it and I'll build something else. And then they get around. I didn't ever evicted them. I just made it so nobody would ever want to live there, or it's unsafe. And so let's look at that. Otherwise, this was, a really good job. And I also think exciting for you to think about how we're creating an entirely new title and what do we want it to look like and how can we do this. So thank you for your good work. But those are the questions that really stuck out to me as I read it.
thank you.
Hi, I do have a question. Why? I guess I don't understand the rationale of leaving the housing mitigation laws. Why is that? I understand the points that you provide in the staff report of the the proposed, but why leaving it?
Why delete the housing loss mitigation report? The way it's currently operates is just largely ineffective, and we're hoping that this is a more effective way to address those. A more effective way within the parameters of state law and what we can do to address displaced housing. That's a simple answer. Nick might have more to add on.
Yeah, the short answer, just to reiterate, is that it's completely ineffective. I think as some of you may have seen or noticed in recent zoning map amendments in particular, there's a housing loss mitigation report that almost always says we're just going to replace the housing, and that satisfies that requirement. And I think in fact it's under that ordinance, I think in the last, I can't remember how many years, but there's something like 200 and something dwellings that have been demolished, but they've been replaced with, do you remember the number? Is it like 4,000, something like that, new dwellings? So the other thing is there's a lot of questions about the fee that is the option there, and it usually results in a number where there's no fee, and it's pretty ineffective. And so what we're trying to do is capture those things that would trigger that anyway. So it's the zoning change when it's to a district that allows non-residential uses, which every single zone in our city allows non-residential uses. So basically any zoning change as a dwelling on it has to go through that. The other one is a conditional use to expand, or I can't remember if it's just expand or a conditional use for a parking lot that results in the demolition. So we're looking at another aspect to replace that. And the third one is, I can't remember it off the top of my head.
So the third one is still requiring data, and then that data has to be recorded as a deed restriction on the property.
Oh, I'm talking about the housing loss mitigation trigger.
Okay. Oh, okay.
It might just be when there's a net loss of a dwelling, regardless of where it is. And so,
No, thank you for the clarification, because we've been using that mitigation loss report in the previous, items. I have another question. So, and just following what Amy had to say about eligibility, I think that, and I don't know if this is in scope, but I think that the $1,500 relocation assistance should be income driven and not necessarily just like everyone should qualify for it. And I have my reasons why. I think that it should be something like what the HUD and federal entities use for rental assistance or home ownership assistance and things like that, that we've seen with ERAP, right, the emergency rental assistance programs and things like that. They use the AMI, which is the area median income, and I wonder if we could do something like that, so their our resources are well managed and distributed to the people who actually need it, to move. And I just think it should be like income driven, or I guess in this case like household driven. And yeah, because we've seen these displacements. I think it in context is right. Like it's people who are being pushed out, but it's the most important thing about this whole proposal, right? It's families who are feeling the burden, right, to leave their homes, and like who can afford that or not. So I do think that to make this a more holistic proposal, it should be something income driven. And I don't even know if we have the capacity or if it's on scope to do that, but that's something that I encourage you guys to look into it.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have one more, I'm reading this more carefully. So I believe that currently the Planning Commission has some responsibility / authority to initiate changes to the various plans. Maybe I'm wrong, but in this particular thing, that is taken away, or it's not there. So can we just take a look at that, or can you explain that?
So right now, there's nothing in our code that gives you that authority to initiate changes to plans. You can to zoning. And I think one of the reasons why that is probably there and why we continued it is because it does require a certain allocation of various resources. Usually if we're going to update a plan, we'll go to the council and try to get some sort of supplementary funding to do that. And we don't always have that. And so that makes it hard. You're the commission, so you can, if you want to add that as something, it's certainly your prerogative to do so.
Well, it might be a recommendation to think about, to have some way of, not necessarily to say you must do this, but to say that the Planning Commission as a whole can recommend that to council, that a certain area be a new plan be devised for some portion of the general plan or for the general plan in general. We may be sitting here totally fed up with Plan Salt Lake in 6 years and go, this is just stupid. We need to, have the ability to recommend to city council, to petition city council that this be something that is redone.
Yeah, we can certainly look at that.
Mr. Chair, I have to leave. Does that mess with our quorum? Am I okay to go?
I think we're okay.
One quick thing. So will these $1,500 be somehow adjusted in the future for inflation and other costs? Currently, I think the average, median rent right now is almost at $1,564 or something. So, but will that be adjusted in the future as everything increases in life? I just wonder if that will be considered.
The current language of the proposal doesn't include that. That's certainly something we can look into adding. And then I think just best practices, we're always looking at our code to update language. So, I don't think that would be too prohibitive.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the affordable housing incentives is that we anticipate, because we're putting in a dollar amount in our code, we anticipate having to look at that periodically to make adjustments.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you're doing.
If we have no further questions, we can go ahead and adjourn since we have run out of items on the agenda. Yes. Yeah, we're running out of commissioners.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.